Hi, my name's Phil Rosie, and I am doing a presentation on bookwork, also known as busy work. Now, the definition of bookwork in my mind is when a teacher will assign students to, say, take their textbook and read a couple of chapters and do some chapter summaries at the end of the chapter. Now, when I was in high school, I always felt like this was a very ineffective way of teaching because of the fact that the students were not being engaged. So I decided to do this presentation for my digital reflection and do some research in my observation to see whether or not this was an effective method. So that begs the question, what is better? Is it better to engage your students, or is it better to have them study from a textbook? And I figured instead of, talking about all these different theories as to why which or the other is better, I decided to ask students. And you see, got a little picture of my survey there that I passed out to the students, and I interviewed 19 students out of one of the classes that I was observing. And from information I extrapolated from the survey, I found that 12 out of 19 students, much, much higher, over half, so very much the majority of the students, prefer to be taught in engaging discussions as opposed to being assigned bookwork. And consistently, the students always said that when they were engaged, they learned a lot more effectively. When they are assigned bookwork, they're just bored and they fall asleep. And I remember when I was a student in high school that this was the exact same kind of reaction that I would have. I always felt like the bookwork was more of an insult to my intelligence because I wasn't being engaged, I wasn't being challenged, I was just, racing to get all the answers finished so I could just get it over with. So I then decided to go to a different viewpoint, and I asked my cooperating teacher a couple of questions about the subject, and they said that it is more just to fill time, and bookwork, when given, it needs to be constructive. It's not something that just has the student filling in random questions. It has to actually enforce the learning and be supportive of the subjects that they're learning. However, despite that, its only appropriate use is when the teacher is not there. So it's just something you give to like a substitute, so the students are actually doing something constructive when you are not present. And however, when the teacher is present, he stated that it is always more important to engage your students than to just assign them random chapter summaries or whatever you want to define bookwork as. So I decided to see how much bookwork was actually being assigned in the school's classes. So from this interview, or excuse me, from the survey that I did with all the other students that I mentioned before, I asked them what classes they had busy work in, and I asked them, just the basic core classes: English, math, science, history, and I asked them whether they receive bookwork 0 to 2 times, 3 to 5 times, 6 to 8 times, or 9 to 11 times in a week. And I also left an option there in case they weren't enrolled in the class, and so that's basically just not important. That's just to account for the students that did not answer some of those questions because they weren't currently taking those classes. So those big old light blue bars there, you just ignore them. But as you look at English and math and science and history, you see that in English there's not appear to be a lot of bookwork, which is surprising considering that it's an English class. And they said that 63% approximately reported little to no book work being assigned, and it was much the same in the history class. In math, however, 50% of students received getting book work. In science as well, over half the students reported this. And in several of these classes, these students are getting just book work, all class, 3 days, sometimes even 5 days a week. And instead of being engaged by their teachers, they are just getting mindless assignments in their books. And beginning to think this is actually a real problem. And the only conclusions that I can come from this is that book work is not only effective, but it's being used far too much. And it is something that should be remedied.